Welcome to this module on how to do what matters most first. I'll share a story with you about one of my first interactions with Gary Keller that really turned my world upside down and one of the most powerful lessons I've learned when it came to my personal productivity. Early on in the first 90 days, Gary and Jay wanted to assess whether or not I could cast a big vision for our company. The way they could assess that is I had to deliver a business plan and get them to sign off on it. So I remember walking into this very room that we're standing right now with my business plan. And it was just one sheet of paper. At the top was one big goal, and then there were simply 3 priorities on there. Priority number 1, priority number 2, and priority number 3. And these were in order of priority. We start talking about priority number 1. Gary and Jay asked a bunch of questions about it. I answered them, and when I thought they were satisfied, I started moving on to number 2. About halfway through number 2, Gary started asking more questions about number 1. I didn't think anything of it. I just answered the questions. And I said, "Are we good?" He goes, "Yep." And so I got back into number 2. I wrapped up number 2 and started getting into number 3, and then Gary started asking more questions about number 1. At this point, I started to feel like I was the only one in the room who didn't know what was going on, but I answered the question anyways. I said, "We good?" He goes, "Yep." I get back into number 3, and I'm talking about it for no more than 10 seconds before Gary stops me a final time. He says, "Quick question. Do you need to accomplish number 3 to accomplish number 2? I said, "No." He said, "Do you need to accomplish number 2 to accomplish number 1? I said, "No." He said, "Then do me a favor. Go ahead and put a line between number 1 and number 2, or even better, just go ahead, rip the page in half. Don't even think about number 2 and number 3 until you've earned the right to by mastering number 1. Here's why I share this with you. We all agree that we have the same number of hours in the day. So why is it that some people get so much done when others look up at the end of the day and even though they were super busy, they questioned if they actually got anything done at all? Have you ever felt this way? The secret to this lies in the fact that millionaires and people who have achieved extraordinary results do what matters most first. In just a minute, I'm going to take you over to Jay Papasan, one of the co-authors of The One Thing, so he can walk you through an exercise on how to begin taking action on this. One suggestion for you, if you've read The One Thing before, then some of this is going to be familiar with you, and this is on purpose. You don't master any book by reading it once or even 3 times. You have to go through a series of repetition and implementation to master any subject matter. With that, let's head over to Jay and he'll walk you through the exercise.
Before we dive into the lesson, I'm just going to take a quick second and kind of tell you how I got here. Now, I moved to Austin, Texas with my wife. I was a freelance writer for a little while, and then I took a job in a small local real estate company called Keller Williams. At that time, I think Keller Williams was in 3 states. It was a pretty small company, 6,700 agents. There were 27 employees at Keller Williams Realty International, and I was a newsletter writer too. Well, about a year and a half into that journey, I saw someone clearly working on a book cover. And I'd come from HarperCollins Publishers. I'd been in book publishing, didn't think that would exist for me in Austin. So I was interested. I said, "What are you working on?" And he said, "Didn't you hear Gary's writing a book?" Now, Gary Keller's the founder, and at that time, he was running the university and our coaching company. But he's the founder of Keller Williams Realty. And I was like, I didn't know that. Well, like 3 days later, I run into Gary in the bathroom. Remember, there's only 27 employees. It's kind of even hard to miss anybody for more than a couple of days. And I turned to Gary, and it was one of those moments that kind of changed my life. I said, "Gary, hey, I've heard that you're working on a book. Do you remember that I used to work in publishing?" And Gary turned to me, and I could see by the look in his eyes that even though we were such a small company, he'd totally forgotten that I'd come from book publishing. And he said, "Hey, come in my office." And, at this moment, he was between coaching calls, like at least 2 days a month. He would talk to all of his top people all day long, and he'd have like maybe 5 minutes off. So this is all happening in that little tiny space between calls. And Gary lays out a vision for writing 13 books. And I remember he's just rattling them off and rattling them off. And he's wrapping up his pitch, and he says, and we went to the bookstore and we picked out 5 of our favorite all-time how-to business books. And he starts laying them out on the table. And I can remember 4 of them. The 5th one still escapes me, but it was The Millionaire Next Door, Bill Phillips' Body for Life, Mia Hamm's Go for the Goal, and Good to Great. And then there's this other book. And this is one of those moments of just pure serendipity, because when I was at HarperCollins, I got to help make Body for Life and Mia Hamm's Go for the Goal. And I got to point that out to him right there on the spot. I said, hey, Gary, I edited those books, and I showed him my name in the books. Well, we were off to the races. Literally the next day, I was sitting in the office just outside his, and we were writing a plan to write our first book together, one that we wrote in just about 90 days. Now, this was a huge moment for me in my life. I found my mentor, my partner at that time, and still my boss, and we had all of these relationships waiting for us just 15 years later. But at that moment, I was getting my first introduction to the power of priority through Gary's eyes. And he absolutely convinced me, right? In 90 days, we wrote a book that's gone on to sell almost 1 million copies in an industry of just over 1 million. His ideas of priority and focus time, he lives it, and he helped me do it. And so here I am, the former ponytailed French English major that became a business writer and now has become an investor. And it's all because you master that one thing. So now that you know where I come from, let's just kind of dive into one of the first big lessons in the book. And having learned about your domino runs and creating a geometric progression, what's the things that holds us back? And in the book, we identified them as the great lies of productivity. And the number one lie is this idea that everything matters equally. So I'm going to be the first to admit, I don't think people walk around arguing that everything matters equally. But here's the truth, that's how we behave. When your to-do list is too long and your calendar is so booked up, you're wondering when you're going to have time to eat, much less go to the bathroom. We've all had moments like this where we have long to-do lists, we're feeling a little bit harried, and it could be for good reasons. It's not necessarily obligations, it might be opportunities that we're chasing, but we feel harried. Now, when we get in that state where we're rushing from opportunity to the next or obligation to the next, we get a little bit like that character in the B horror movie. That's what we wrote in the book. The guy that runs up the stairs instead of out the front door? Well, that's a great metaphor for how we respond under stress. We get reactive. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in that state of mind, I'll look at my to-do list, and instead of doing the most important thing, I'll do the things I can cross off the fastest. And I think we all fall prey to that trap. And the moment we do, everything matters equally. Well, the way we want to counter that is something you've probably heard of, and it's called Pareto's Principle, and it's the 80-20 rule. And just to give you the high-level understanding, okay, this guy named Alfredo Pareto, back in the 1800s, observed that 80% of the wealth was held by roughly 20% of the people in Italy. Not much was made of it. Later, a guy named Joseph Duran kind of heard about this research, but he was in quality control. And he looked up and said, wow, okay, that's not just true of wealth, that's true of maybe everything. Because he could see assembly lines, and he knew that 80% of the flaws came from 20% of the defects. And boom, he started writing about it and actually popularized the idea, and it's turned out its own list of bestsellers. So here it is, the bare nuggets that you need to know. The majority of your results, the 80% in quotes, will come from the minority of your efforts, the 20%. It's that simple. The numbers actually don't matter. Maybe it's the 10% of the things that you do that get you half your results. But if you look closely at what you do, there are a few things that matter and a lot of things that don't. And the moment you acknowledge this, like the law of gravity, folks, I mean, this is a success law that most people just don't get. It's their number one stumbling block to time blocking. So we even asked Gary about this before we started this course. We said, what's the number one thing? What's the one thing that holds people back from really effectively time blocking their one thing? And he said it's because they don't really buy into the 80-20 principle. And that's one of the reasons why it's lie number one for us. If there's only one lie we can address, it's going to be this one. Do you understand where your priorities lie? And can you actually focus on the things that will get you the most success in whatever it is that you're doing? So you take that, and here's the first practical takeaway. This is something that you can absolutely do every day. We want you to turn your to-do list into a success list. It's that simple. Most of you have one. Maybe you have it on an app on your phone. Maybe you have it on a piece of paper. Maybe you have it in a journal. However you keep it, it doesn't matter. But acknowledge this. Of all the things that you could do, there's only a handful that you should do. And then you take those things, you identify them, and I want you to number them. The thing about working with Gary Keller in this office, you don't hand him a bulleted list. He'll just politely push it back and say, would you mind numbering these? Because he wants to know what the number one thing is. And if you're in a meeting and you're number one on the agenda, that's awesome. Because we're probably not getting off number one. If you're number two, you're lucky to get there by the end of the hour. Because Gary understands until we're done with number one, everything else doesn't matter. But we don't all live this way, and we don't start our days this way. So take your to-do list and turn it into a success list. Have a good friend. He takes 5 minutes every day. That's all it takes to do this. You know what you need to be doing, but do you know where you should start? The most successful people in the world launch their days by focusing on one thing. They're number one. And if they get that done, they do the number two. If they get that done, they do the number three. But if you really treat it this way, you're not going to have more than 4 or 5 things. I love this because I look at that list and I just realize most of the stuff doesn't matter. I don't have to get that stressed out about it. I need to focus on the things that matter. And if I start my days there, it's going to be an awesome day. So I'm going to challenge you to get an exercise right now. I want you to get a piece of paper and a pencil or a pen, whatever it takes, okay? And I want you to craft your to-do list. And I'm just going to do one by example here for you. Let's just imagine that today you've got, here are some things that you have to get done at work. You're going to review your budget numbers. You're going to manage your emails. You've got a presentation that you've got to prepare for. You've got to look over some resumes because you're hoping to bring someone new onto your team, and you've actually got an interview, right, with one of the candidates. So I just listed them. There's no priority there. I want you to take your list, hit pause again, and now I want you to number them in the order of priority that they matter most. And here's how you do it. If there's only one thing I can get done today, what's it going to be? I'm just going to say, you know, the thing I need more than anything is I need help. I need a great person on my team. So my number one's going to be resumes. Tied to that, maybe my number one person is that interview. So boom, there's one and there's two. Well, by the way, my presentation is going to put me in front of a lot of people that might want to join my team. So I'm going to go to number 3. And if I can get all 3 of those things done, I'm going to do my emails and manage my budget. Now, budget might be your number one priority, and I'm not just trying to put it off because I'm an English major, but that's how, in this situation, I dove into it. Now, here's the second step. This is where a lot of people stop, and that's actually will get you 90% of the way. If this truly is your number one, I want you to take another step. Hit pause, and I want you to list out what are the 3 or 4 things I need to do to make sure that I get these resumes reviewed on time. And so you're going to list those things out, whatever they are. I've got to check Indeed.com. I've got to check Monster.com. I've got to check Craigslist, whatever it is, however you're getting those applicants. And then I want you to do the same thing. I want you to number those so that you know the priority. And if it's a really big thing, and this is like a world-conquering day for you, you may get to do that exercise again. This is what we call going extreme Pareto. What's the 20% of the 20% of the 20%? There's a cool little graphic we put in the book. If you take all the things that you could be doing, you take the 20% of that, you get a small list. That's a manageable list. You keep going, you might get down to the one core activity that's going to drive your entire day. That's how we defeat the lie of everything matters equally. And if you just start by launching your days with a success list, you're going to immediately start seeing results and start getting that hockey stick growth. It'll surprise you how fast it'll start happening.
Jay just shared our system for doing what matters most first. Like we mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you've read the one thing before, then you're familiar with the idea of turning a to-do list into a success list. Our question to you is, have you mastered acting in order of priority? Have you developed a rock-solid habit of only taking action in order of priority? You only do your most important work first, and you say no to everything else until it's done. Or do you still feel like you could improve in this area? We find most people can improve, which is why we share this information with you. Our goal in this module is to remind you how important it is that you begin acting in order of priority. Out of the entire crash course, if you just made a habit of this one thing, you'd get a huge return on your investment. Out of all my experience with Gary and Jay, this has been the single most impactful lesson I've learned. That's why our call to action from this module is for you to get out a sheet of paper and identify all your to-dos for this week, and then turn them into a success list by applying priority to them. You'll need this for an upcoming module, so make sure you take action on this, and I'll see you in the next video.